Welcome, friends, to another edition of the Economic Reality Report. I'm glad you could join us. Before we begin, just a quick note. Next week, I'll be hosting a live discussion on the end of industrial America. Can the middle class be rebuilt? Followed by a seminar on the hidden costs of tariffs in our public universities. Also, my new book, Profit Without Purpose, is now available, examining how economic nationalism often turns against its own citizens. Now, let's get into today's story. President Donald Trump back in the White House and back at war, not with a foreign army, but with the global trading system itself. A few hours ago, he signed an executive order imposing a 25% tariff on all imported cars, set to take effect on April 2nd. In his words, it's a move to bring back American jobs. But as we've learned in economics and in history, what's promised as protection often becomes punishment. Before jumping in, let's remember how we got here. 5 years ago, the first round of tariffs on steel, aluminum, and Chinese goods was justified as a way to level the playing field. Instead, they leveled something else, the very industries they were meant to defend. Prices rose, exports fell, and trade partners retaliated. By the end of 2019, U.S. farmers, auto workers, and manufacturers had lost billions in revenue. Economists called it a self-inflicted wound. Now, with the new 25% car tariff, that wound may reopen deeper this time and bleeding through the core of America's industrial heartland. Let's begin with what's really at stake. When you hear car imports, don't imagine distant ships unloading foreign luxury sedans. Think instead of Detroit, Ohio, Tennessee, and Texas, the backbone of America's auto ecosystem. For decades, U.S. factories depended not only on domestic labor, but on a tightly woven global supply chain. Engines from Canada, batteries from South Korea, microchips from Taiwan, and steel stamped in Mexico. It was a system of interdependence, efficient, if fragile. Now, a 25% tariff tears through that fabric like a blade. What we are witnessing is the expansion of a global trade war, but it's not fought with tanks. It's fought with paperwork, taxes, and executive orders. Each tariff triggers a response, retaliation, countermeasure, withdrawal. Europe, Japan, and even Canada are preparing reciprocal duties. The America First doctrine, in practice, means everyone else second, including the American consumer. The irony is striking. The very promise was to rebuild domestic manufacturing, yet the first casualties are American workers themselves. Why? Because tariffs don't create factories. They create costs. Every car imported from Germany, Japan, or even Canada now costs a quarter more to bring in. And for companies that rely on cross-border production, that price hike is catastrophic. Automakers pass those costs to dealers, dealers to consumers, and consumers, well, they stop buying. Let's take a step back. For much of the 20th century, auto production was the pride of the U.S. economy. The roar of engines and the hum of assembly lines weren't just sounds. They were symbols of a national identity. The auto industry built a middle class, provided pensions, and funded local schools. When those plants thrived, America thrived. But now, what once hummed with life has fallen silent. In parts of Detroit, you can still see the skeletons of the old factories, hollowed out shells of glass and steel, silent witnesses to decades of policy failure. This tariff expansion isn't happening in a vacuum. It's taking place after years of offshoring, automation, and wage stagnation. The economic soil has already been eroded. To impose tariffs now is like pouring salt on barren ground and calling it cultivation. Yet the narrative remains seductive. Protect our workers, bring jobs home. Who could oppose that? It sounds patriotic, almost noble. But patriotism is no substitute for planning. The truth is, jobs don't return just because imports are punished. They return when investment, innovation, and infrastructure make domestic production competitive again. Tariffs are the shortcut, and like most shortcuts in economics, they lead to dead ends. Still, the administration insists this is a win. White House advisors promise that the tariffs will force automakers to manufacture in America. But history tells a different story. Companies don't build where it's most patriotic. They build where it's most profitable. If the costs rise here, they'll move elsewhere. Mexico, Canada, Vietnam, wherever the math makes sense. Already analysts warn of what's coming. Price hikes, layoffs, plant closures. The same script we've seen before, only faster this time. And the most tragic part? The rhetoric will remain the same. We're protecting America. No, what we're protecting is a political illusion. Let's begin with the headline that shook the markets. Tesla's retreat from America. It was the story no one wanted to believe, the crown jewel of U.S. innovation, the poster child of Silicon Valley's promise, packing up and leaving home. Yet that's exactly what happened in the wake of the new auto tariffs. Before we dissect the numbers, let's remember what Tesla represented. It wasn't just a car company, it was a statement, a claim that American technology could leap ahead of the world. For investors, it was the future. For workers, it was hope. For Washington, it was proof that made in the USA still meant something. And then came the tariff shock. In a single quarter, the company's operating costs rose by $300 million, directly linked to duties on imported parts, batteries, sensors, precision metals. These aren't luxuries, they're necessities. Without them, Tesla can't build cars. The result? Wall Street panic. Tesla's stock fell nearly 20% in 1 week, erasing billions in value. The same administration that claimed to defend American industry had unintentionally destabilized its flagship innovator. Now, here's what that means beyond the ticker symbol. When Tesla's margins collapsed, so did its American projects. The much celebrated 4,680 battery program, the one hailed as the backbone of U.S. energy independence, was quietly moved to Quebec. Canada offered incentives worth $1.2 billion. Washington countered with slogans. And so the new frontier of clean energy moved north. Don't be fooled. This wasn't just corporate opportunism. It was strategic survival. Businesses operate on cost, not on campaign speeches. When the policy environment turns volatile, capital migrates, and capital, once it leaves, rarely returns. Here's the cruel irony. Tariffs were meant to punish foreign imports. Instead, they punished domestic innovators who depended on international cooperation. Tesla's decision triggered a ripple across the industry. Suppliers froze contracts, research projects stalled, and subcontractors, often small family-run firms, began to fold. The pain didn't stop at the production line. Tesla's collapse in U.S. operations exposed another fragile pillar, carbon credits. For years, Tesla balanced its books through emissions penalties imposed on other automakers. Those credits weren't just revenue, they were leverage. They kept the company afloat while it invested in future tech. But when the administration rolled back environmental regulations, to boost competitiveness, those credits vanished. In less than a fiscal year, Tesla lost $2.8 billion in carbon revenue. The supposed deregulation designed to help industry ended up choking the one company that actually embodied clean innovation. This tells us something fundamental about how economic nationalism works, or rather, how it fails. It assumes that protecting one part of the system automatically strengthens the whole, but in a globalized economy, that's not how it works. Supply chains, research networks, and investment flows are interconnected. You can't hammer one link without weakening the chain. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, it was designed to shield American farmers during the Great Depression. Instead, it deepened that depression. Global trade collapsed by 60% and unemployment soared. 80 years later, we seem determined to relearn the same painful lesson. Protectionism is isolation by another name. Meanwhile, the rhetoric continues. Officials celebrate reshoring as if the act of returning production automatically guarantees prosperity. But reshoring isn't revival. It's relocation, often temporary, often mechanized, rarely labor intensive. Even when factories return, they bring robots, not workers. The community that once depended on wages and pensions now watches machines do the work they once did. And so the paradox grows clearer. We live in a system that celebrates the worker in speeches, but sacrifices them in spreadsheets. It praises competition while outlawing cooperation. It calls tariffs a defense of freedom, even as they restrict choice, reduce trade, and drive prices higher. Tesla's retreat is more than a corporate story. It's a mirror showing us that the real threat to American industry isn't foreign competition. It's policy built on nostalgia instead of reality. Now let's move to the older names, the ones carved into the foundation of American capitalism: Cadillac, Ford, and General Motors. These companies are not just manufacturers, they are monuments. For nearly a century, they embodied the promise that industrial labor could sustain a middle-class life, but that promise too is now being dismantled under the weight of a tariff war. Start with Cadillac. Once the symbol of achievement, it now sits trapped in a market it can no longer afford to serve. The new tariffs add between $4,000 and $10,000 to the cost of every vehicle imported or assembled with foreign parts, which in today's supply chain means almost every car. The result? The flagship Escalade, once a proud badge of luxury, now sells for over $93,000. That's not prestige, that's exclusion. Showrooms across the Midwest are empty. Salespeople whisper that foot traffic is down 40%. The American dream on wheels has become a dream deferred. And then General Motors. In Tennessee, its electric vehicle program, the Vistic, once hailed as the bridge to a cleaner future, is now being wound down. The official reason? Market realignment. The real reason? Tariff-induced cost spikes that made U.S. assembly unprofitable. GM announced it would halt production of several EV models by late 2025. That means thousands of jobs gone, and with them, local tax revenues, school budgets, and small-town economies built on those paychecks. In Arlington, Texas, the mayor stood before cameras and called the policy a job-killing order disguised as patriotism. It wasn't rhetoric, it was arithmetic. Every 1% tariff increase translated to hundreds of layoffs in his city alone. Meanwhile, Ford, the company whose founder once defined American manufacturing itself, faces losses exceeding $1.5 billion since the tariff expansion. In just months, Ford has shuttered plants in both Chicago and Michigan. 9,000 workers gone. Entire neighborhoods have fallen silent. You can walk through once bustling streets and hear your own footsteps. The diners that served plant workers now sit empty, windows dark, coffee pots cold. Local papers run obituaries, not for people, but for entire livelihoods. This is the paradox of modern economic nationalism. It speaks the language of revival, bringing back jobs, protecting our workers, but the mechanism it uses destroys precisely what it claims to defend. The tariffs raise costs, reduce competitiveness, and push production elsewhere. In the end, foreign factories grow, while domestic ones close. Now, across the Atlantic, the pain spreads further. Stellantis, the parent company of Chrysler, Jeep, and Dodge, has reported $2, $3 billion in total losses, $330 million of that directly from tariffs. Assembly lines stand idle. Almost 900 American workers have been laid off. Executives in private call it a slow motion collapse. They know the truth. The math no longer adds up. What began as a protectionist policy has become an evacuation order for industrial capital. And this is not just about cars. It's about the political illusion that economic sovereignty can be rebuilt through isolation. The United States doesn't manufacture in a vacuum. Every car is a global collaboration. Steel from Mexico, chips from Korea, electronics from Germany, rubber from Thailand. Cut one link and the machine seizes. To understand the scale of what's happening, think of this. In just the second quarter of 2025, General Motors reported $1.1 billion in losses. Chevrolet and Nissan, both of which once stamped made in the USA as a badge of pride, have moved production abroad to Mexico and South Korea. The Chevy Silverado, a truck once built in Detroit, is now assembled south of the border. The same badge, the same model, but not the same meaning. And yet, in political speeches, nothing seems amiss. The narrative remains. We're taking back control. But what does control mean when you can't even build your own product without importing half its parts? What does sovereignty mean when capital flees the very borders you seek to fortify? This is the silent tragedy of the tariff era. Not the headlines of billion-dollar losses, but the small invisible fractures that run through towns, through families, through the fragile link between work and dignity. Factories that once ran 3 shifts now run none. Mechanics retrain as delivery drivers. Children leave the towns their parents built because there's nothing left to inherit. And the most striking image of all, the quiet. The sound that used to define America, the hum of the assembly line, the whistle of the morning shift, now replaced by stillness. Let's turn our attention southward to the states once hailed as the new Detroit, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee. For the past 2 decades, these regions were the beating heart of foreign investment places, where automakers like Hyundai, Kia, and Nissan built sprawling plants and reshaped entire local economies. Governors touted them as proof that made in America still meant something, even when the companies themselves were Korean or Japanese. Now those same states are feeling the ground give way beneath them. Take Hyundai, a company that once represented the perfect compromise between American jobs and global efficiency. It built cars on your S soil, paid local taxes, employed tens of thousands, and kept prices low enough for working class families. But the new tariff regime, combined with strict immigration crackdowns, has torn that model apart. In the second quarter of 2025, Hyundai reported a 20% drop in profit, not because its cars lost appeal, but because its production costs soared. Tariffs have inflated the price of imported parts. The crackdown on migrant labor has drained the workforce that kept its assembly lines running. And then came the raid. At Hyundai's vast battery plant in Georgia, a complex once celebrated as the future of green manufacturing, federal agents stormed in. In a single sweep, 475 workers were detained. Overnight, production collapsed. Shifts were canceled. Supply schedules disintegrated. The official narrative framed it as law enforcement success. But on the factory floor, it was something else entirely. A human disaster, a revelation of how dependent American manufacturing had become on migrant labor. Here's the reality most policymakers refuse to say aloud. Modern U.S. industry survives on the invisible backbone of immigrants. They assemble the cars, pack the batteries, clean the facilities, and keep the logistics running. When that lifeline is severed, whether by raids or by rhetoric, the machine stops. Within weeks, Hyundai began to reconsider its entire North American strategy. The company quietly redirected new investment, about $800 million originally earmarked for Georgia, to Vietnam and India, where labor is cheaper and governments more predictable. It wasn't a protest, it was a calculation. In global capitalism, uncertainty is the highest cost of all. The lesson here is sobering. When tariffs and political theater replace long-term industrial planning, corporations don't adapt, they escape. They take their jobs, their research, their tax revenue, and they leave. Every closure they announce isn't just an economic event, it's a migration of power. Look deeper and you'll see a pattern. Washington punishes imports to save American jobs. Companies relocate to avoid the punishment. Communities lose those jobs entirely. Consumers pay higher prices, and the cycle repeats, dressed up each time as patriotism. It's the same old logic, the belief that borders can substitute for strategy, but self-reliance cannot be legislated by decree. It must be built patiently with infrastructure, education, and technological investment. Without those pillars, protectionism is just nationalism with a price tag. Consider what's happening now in rural America. Pickup trucks, once symbols of working class pride, are now $8,000 to $10,000 more expensive. Families that could once buy a Ford F-150 or a Hyundai Santa Fe are holding on to decade-old vehicles, pouring savings into endless repairs. Mechanics are busier than ever, but not because business is booming. It's because people can't afford new cars anymore. Meanwhile, politicians point to the same assembly plants and claim victory, ignoring that half of their machines stand idle. They call this economic resilience. But resilience built on decline isn't strength, it's denial. Here's the deeper contradiction. The United States proclaims independence from global supply chains, even as its own factories depend on imported parts, migrant hands, and foreign capital. It demands domestic production, but cuts education and training budgets that would make that possible. In other words, the nation wants the fruits of globalization without its roots. By the way, this isn't new. In the 1,980 seconds when Reagan imposed quotas on Japanese cars, it didn't bring back the big three. It simply pushed Japanese automakers to build plants in America, the very ones now under threat today. The wheel turns, but the pattern remains. The real question isn't whether tariffs can protect American jobs. They can't. The question is whether America still understands what kind of economy it truly has. Is it industrial, global, digital, or simply nostalgic? Because nostalgia cannot build engines and slogans don't pay mortgages. Let's conclude where this story truly lives, not in the stock market, not in the headlines, but in the everyday lives of ordinary people. The trade war that began with fanfare in Washington has reached the street corner diner in Ohio, the school in Tennessee, the mechanic's shop in Michigan. The noise of politics has faded, leaving behind the quiet arithmetic of hardship. Families now face car prices $3,000 to $10,000 higher than a year ago. A simple vehicle purchase, once a rite of passage, a symbol of mobility, has become a financial gamble. Mechanics speak of customers breaking down in tears because their 10-year-old cars can no longer pass inspection and a replacement is out of reach. That's not theory. That's policy translated into pain. Before jumping to solutions, we need to face a difficult truth. This isn't just an economic failure, it's a democratic one. When a president can trigger a global trade crisis with a signature, without public debate, without congressional oversight, without a coherent industrial strategy, that's not strength, that's concentration of power. And when the victims of that policy are told to celebrate their suffering as patriotism, that's not democracy. That's manipulation. This, friends, is the oldest paradox of capitalism dressed in modern clothes. A system that creates insecurity, then sells it back as identity. It destroys stable jobs, then tells workers to take pride in flexibility. It raises prices, then blames immigrants, unions, or foreign competitors for the fallout. It's a loop of distraction, one that keeps voters angry but not empowered. Let's not forget, tariffs are not paid by the countries we target. They're paid by us, by consumers, by workers, by small businesses. When you buy a car that costs more because of a 25% import duty, you're paying for Washington's illusion of control. The foreign manufacturer, they adjust. The American public, they absorb. And yet, despite this, the rhetoric continues to sell America first. It has a rhythm, a simplicity that's easy to chant and hard to challenge. But what it really means in practice is workers last. In a truly democratic economy, protection would mean protecting people, their wages, their health care, their right to organize, not protecting corporate profits or political slogans. Let's recall a time when the social contract meant something. After World War II, American manufacturing thrived not because it walled itself off, but because it invested in education, in infrastructure, in public science. Productivity gains translated into wages, not just shareholder dividends. That model didn't collapse by accident, it was dismantled by design. The trade wars we see now are not an act of rebellion against globalization. They are the end game of a half century of corporate deregulation masquerading as nationalism. Now, as the dust settles, other nations are moving in. Canada attracts Tesla. Europe tightens its trade networks. South Korea and Vietnam are becoming new industrial anchors. America, the self-declared leader of the free market, is watching from the sidelines, handcuffed by its own contradictions. So, where do we go from here? We could continue this cycle: tariffs, retaliation, layoffs, and speeches, or we could start confronting the real issue. Who benefits from chaos? Because make no mistake, someone always does. While factories close, capital relocates. While workers lose jobs, stock buybacks surge. The system hasn't failed. It's succeeding exactly as designed to serve the few at the expense of the many. That's why we need a deeper conversation about democracy, not as a political ritual, but as an economic reality. Democracy must exist in the workplace as much as at the ballot box. Workers should have a voice in the decisions that determine their futures. Tariffs imposed from above do not protect them. Participation from below might. In the end, this story is not just about cars. It's about control, who has it, who doesn't, and who pretends to. America once built engines that powered the world. Now it builds narratives that distract it from its own decline. But decline is not destiny. It's a choice. And like all choices, it can be unmade. Thank you for joining us. I look forward to speaking with you again next week.